This video is very interesting because obviously I was recently on Tucker Carlson. And when I was on Tucker Carlson, we talked a lot about the nature of civilizations and understandings of the world, right? And that your different tradition, background, heritage, your religious values, these things, your language, they define the way you see the world. They define the way that you understand the world around you. And so when we're trying to interact with other people, we have to recognize that they often have a very different basis for how they have norms and expectations in society. And that, as I said on the show when I was with Tucker, the Constitution and the American system were specifically designed for specific people, a people with a specific way of life. And if you're not from that tradition, if you're not familiar with those norms, if this isn't the heritage you grew up with, the history you grew up with, the faith you grew up with, the rationality, the epistemology that you grew up with, then you have a very different understanding of the world. It might be difficult for you to become part of the American system. Now, some people can, right? There are people who can accept that way of life and join it after generations. Their children's children's children can become part of that story and that legacy. But the people themselves give birth to the culture, not the other way around. And so it's really critical when you're looking at how to manage society. What should we bring in a bunch of people from across the world? Does it matter? Will a guy from England assimilate easier into the United States than someone from Madagascar? Is there any difference between somebody in Southeast Asia and somebody in Finland when it comes from their ability to kind of integrate into the US? These are important questions, and ones that if you just assume everyone is the same and everyone thinks the same and everyone acts the same and everyone understands the world the same, then you could fall into the error of believing that everyone can just become American. Everyone is just a potential American waiting to raise their hand and give the Pledge of Allegiance and swear an oath to the United States and then become a U.S. citizen. But that's just not the case. When we talk about the way of knowing things, the way of understanding things, the way of being, we're talking things that are tied to a people, right? And so this video has been going around on the internet. I'm going to play some of it and we'll talk about it as we go. But this is a young Black woman from Africa discussing African philosophy. She's talking about, I guess, one of the premier African philosophers. I'm not super familiar with African philosophy, so I'm not going to pretend to be any kind of authority there. But to her, this philosopher is very important, and she says, wildly different understanding of time, just a radically different understanding of reality. So let me play some of this real quick.
If I told you that for many African societies, the concept of the future doesn't exist, and that instead of time moving forwards, time actually moves backwards. This was the work of...
So already we see a very, very different understanding of what time could be. Time does not move forward. We're not progressing through time. Time moves backwards. Now, I think both of these are kind of wrong in a way, but the point being, this has radical implications for the way you organize your society. Radical implications for how you understand how you should, treat each other, planning for the future. All of these things are very critical. And if you don't have the same conception of time, you can't plan around them. Like, we all assume our conception of time is universal. Of course, this is how I experience time. This is how time works. But she's saying, no, in Africa, we believe time works entirely differently. Now, we know that something like language is a barrier to communication and custom is a barrier to cooperation. But time is like one of the most fundamental understandings necessary to coordinate anything about our civilization. And she's saying, we don't even have the same conception of that. Like, we can't even grasp time in the same way because we have radically different understandings of how time works. That makes being a part of each other's civilizations very, very difficult. This is a radical difference, a difference so radical it makes cooperation basically impossible. So let's hear a little more.
Of John Mbiti, one of Kenya's and Africa's greatest philosophers. And in 1969, he wrote something that completely reimagines the way we think of African time. Mbiti says time is a two-dimensional phenomenon with a long past, vibrant present, and virtually no future. Using Swahili words, he describes the two dimensions of time. The first one being sasa, the now, the recent past, and the immediate future which can be experienced. The second dimension is zamani. Zamani is the vast, endless past where all events eventually go on to live forever. But the future in African thought, it barely exists because...
So the future in African thought, according to this preeminent philosopher in Africa, does not exist. The implications of that are vast, right? They are almost too numerous to take time to go through. I mean, if you do not have a future, how do you understand planning for something? How do you understand a time preference, a lower time preference that would allow you to build civilization? How do you understand denying yourself today so that you can thrive tomorrow, or that your children or your grandchildren can benefit from long laboring work that you put in and planned for and denied yourself in the future? None of that exists. It's all gone. The idea of you need to maintain things because you're going to need them in the future, it just doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. You have the past, you have the long dead past where things go after they've happened a very long time ago. You got the present, you've got like the near future, the things that are just about to happen, just around the corner. But the idea of like a long off future that you need to prepare for doesn't exist. There's no conception of it. And if you don't have a conception of the future, how do you plan for it? How do you put aside money? How do you put aside food for the winter? Well, in a lot of situations, she'll explain, Africans haven't had to, so they don't have these experiences.
Time is made up of events. Time has to be experienced in order to be real. So because we can't conceptualize events tied to the distant future because they haven't been experienced yet, then therefore the future cannot constitute part of time. And this is why, according to Mbiti, African languages, at least the East African Bantu languages that he studied, don't have a word to describe the distant future.
No word to describe the distant future. They don't have the language for the concept, much less practice the concept. There isn't even a word to explain the concept to them because they do not have it. It does not exist because time has to be experienced in this way. It has to be experienced. If you can kind of have a short idea of the future, like the immediate future, because it's about to be experienced. But the idea of a long-term future that you might never experience or will only be experienced in a decade or something simply does not exist. Okay? If you've read Alexander Dugin, you're actually pretty familiar with this fact, actually. Alexander Dugin talks about this in the Fourth Political Theory, that time is phenomenological and that different peoples experience time in radically different ways. And so if you're from a culture that experiences time in this very tribal way, a time that has to be, there is no abstract time. There's no understanding of time as this separate thing, but time is only what is experienced. Then you have a vastly different understanding of it than someone who has a culture entirely built on time, right? So much of Western culture requires the understanding of time. How are you going to make a contract to fulfill in the future if you don't understand that there is a future? How do you set time zones and delivery schedules? How do you make agreements? How do you plan to do shipping across half the globe? How do you land planes if you don't understand the future? If you can't plan because you don't understand time that has not been directly experienced. There are huge implications for this. And again, Dugin has been talking about this. This is if you've read Heidegger or any of these, you understand, the understanding that you have to experience a lot of this stuff, and the direct experience is a critical part of understanding. And so this is known and talked about, but most people just assume that everybody experiences time in exactly the same way. And then, and this is why, again, when I was on Tucker, I said, it's critical to understand the phrase self-evident truths means for people inside your tradition, inside your society, inside your sphere of knowledge, people who share your faith, your heritage, your history, your language. When we talk about self-evident truths, we mean things that are self-evident to us as a people. Because what's self-evident to you, there is a future, we need to plan for it, might be completely not evident at all to someone who's a preeminent African philosopher. Like, it might not even occur in the slightest that is self-evident, because it is not self-evident for them, the way they live their lives. And to be clear, Dugan says we shouldn't be chauvinist about this at the end of the day. They experience things differently. They have a different belief system. They have a different understanding. And that's the way their lives are lived. And we won't be able to force our beliefs on everybody. You can say, democracy is objectively the best system, or this is the way I experience time, and you'll be right for you. But it's going to be difficult for them to understand that, to grasp that, because the truth is not self-evident. There's an entirely different set of beliefs working under the surface that you don't even understand. You can't even get your head around. I mean, if you have an understanding of the future, then how do you even live your life interacting with people who do not? What does that even look like? How do you even have discussions? Right? We'll make a deal and figure this out in a year. That will mean nothing to the people you're talking about. They do not have the conception. We need to delay this process so we can have more later. Does not compute. Does not make sense. We have not experienced later yet. So we cannot possibly know that we need that. The only way we'll know it is when we get there. All of these have vast, again, implications for the way you run society.
In African time, according to Mbiti, events create time. Seasons, ceremonies, a conversation, those moments produce time, and people produce as much time as they need. An example that Mbiti uses from the communities that he studied is that a year is measured based on 4 seasons, 2 dry seasons, 2 wet seasons. So a year is only over when those 4 seasons have taken place. So a year could take 365 days, 390 days. It doesn't matter the number of days in a year. What matters is that the 4 seasons have taken place.
So she's explaining here the belief that time is something that only occurs after certain events have happened. There's a certain set of events that occur, and then time has taken place. And people create time as they experience these events. Again, very phenomenological understanding of time. The time is created as you're experiencing these events. No abstract understanding of time. No idea that there's time outside of the individual experiencing things. No idea that, a time could be an abstract set of, days. No, time is these seasons, these experiences. And so if a season is extra long or extra short, then time changes. Time is not the static thing you measure. It is something that is very dynamic and can change radically depending on how you are experiencing the world, what happens, right? Very different understanding of time. In ways, has some truth to it, but makes it pretty hard to, again, make train schedules or, land airplanes or ship things across the ocean, because those things all require really abstract understandings of time. I don't know what season, how long the seasons are going to be for the next 6 months, but I need to make sure that this shipment is going to get somewhere in 6 months. And so whether or not the seasons pass or not, that ship still needs to arrive, because if the ship doesn't arrive where it needs to, then it can't pick up the next thing and move to the next port. And so the planning out of time in an abstract and measurable manner is pretty critical to the Western understanding. To do any of the trade or any of the capital activities that we do, you need to have this more rigid understanding of time. So, in a way, our system might only be functional for people who understand time that way. The entire global trade system might be completely unmanageable for people who do not have that conception of time, who cannot abstract time out into calculable units that are reliable. And in her understanding and in the African understanding of this philosopher, that is not how time works. And so people who do not have a word to describe this phenomenon are going to have a very, very hard time working inside our system, adopting our customs. And they're going to lose out in the larger global economic picture, the geopolitical picture. And this is what a lot of people actually complain about on the left, right? They say, well, your understanding is very Western and imperialistic or whatever. And you can take the imperialism to the side for a moment, but it is very Western. Yes, it is Western centric. It is racist to the extent that it favors people of European descent who understand the world in this way. But that's also why it works, because that's how the understanding of time allows you to behave. And so if you have this civilizational understanding of how time works, then you will structure your society in a radically different way than people from Africa. And maybe, that's good for the African civilization. Maybe that's the way they want to live. But it will fall behind people who have a different conception of reality, a different understanding of time. Again, you don't have to hate people or, even make fun of people or something because they have this different understanding. But you definitely need to factor that in when you're deciding who should be in your country and whether or not your system can be applied to other people.
This is in contrast to the Western view towards time, where time is a commodity, something that can be spent, saved, wasted, or lost. And according to Mbiti, this is why if foreigners come to Africa and they see people sitting under a tree, they would remark that, okay, why are these people wasting so much time? But in African thought, that sitting under a tree, it's not wasting time. It's either waiting for time or producing time. For me, I think this Western...
So if you're sitting around, you're not wasting time. You're producing time. You're waiting for time. So the idea that time is a commodity, that time is something that is precious, that time is something that you should allocate thoughtfully to activities that better you or society, this does not exist. There is no understanding that time is a limited and finite thing to be allocated properly. This simply does not occur. Again, that's not bad. That's the way that they want to live, the way that they have lived their lives, the understanding their community has. But it's just not compatible with the Western understanding of how time works. This is why you tend to judge people who act that way as lazy in the West, mainly because a lot of us have this understanding that, no, we should be using our time productively. Time is something that is precious, that is limited, that can be allocated to good and bad ends. And that if you are just sitting around not using your time at all, then you end up creating a worse society. Now, to be clear, there's an unhealthy version of this, right? So you might say, oh, well, that African understanding of time is very bad because it creates lazy people. But of course, there is, famously people talking about the Protestant work ethic and Americans working too hard. There is probably a level of that where Americans burn themselves out. Now, that's why we build great things, right? We build amazing things because we work so hard and because we have a vision of the future. We understand time in this way. We understand it could be wasted and we don't want to. But at the same time, we can harm ourselves. We can live less fulfilling lives in some ways because we're so busy grinding all the time. I got to work. And if you're doing that work for greatness, that's awesome. But if you're just channeling it into like a, some kind of corporation or, some kind of complete waste job that doesn't do anything for people who hate you or aren't producing anything of value, well, I mean, it's admirable that you're working in a way, but, you're also just kind of wasting all that for nothing. So, there are downsides to this, But I want to live the Western way of life. That's who I am. That's how I understand the world. That's how I understand time. It's what's natural to me. It makes sense because I was born into this culture. It's what my father and my grandfather and my great grandfather, that's how they understood the world. So it's how I understand the world. And I want to live in this way. And if she wants to live in a different way, that's fine. But then we probably aren't going to be able to share values. We're not going to share an understanding of the good, the way that the world should work, the way that we should order society, because there's a fundamental difference at the core of our understanding of the world.
An idea of time as a commodity is what drives this Western obsession of progress, development, and some promised future. And this difference shapes everything from politics, economics, to how we live our daily lives. Because in African thought, the golden age isn't in the future, it's actually in the Zamani. According to Mbiti, the future is only a shadow until it comes to the present, and then it flows into the Zamani. So in that way, time moves backwards. We are not the ones who move forward into time.
So again, just a very different understanding of how the world works. You're not moving forward into time. You're not supposed to make tomorrow better. There is no idea of progress. I have my own issues with progress, but we won't get into that now. But there is no idea that you should put off today to put off getting something good or fun or whatever you want today because of tomorrow. That's not how it works. The golden age is in the past. The future doesn't really exist until it's been experienced in the present. And then those events move into the past, and that's where all the good things are. So it's a fundamentally rear-looking understanding, right? It's not looking forward. It's not future-oriented. It's not because they don't have a word for it. It's not forward-facing. It's always the past. It's always the things just come out of the future. They're experienced, and then they move into the past. And that's how time flows. Radically different understanding. As she says, this is all, the idea of technological progress and, science and ambition and achievement. These things are all tied to Western understandings of how time works. And if you're someone who has only ever experienced other people with this grasp of time, then you'll just assume that this is how the entire world sees it, because why wouldn't they? It's so obvious to you. It's self-evident. The truth is self-evident. But this truth is as self-evident to her. She sees this. Many Africans see the world exactly this way and think it's foolish to understand it any other. Again, you don't need to mock it. You don't need to hate it. But you do need to understand it. You do need to factor this in when you're trying to grasp, should we have immigration? Should people with this belief flood the UK or the United States? Are they compatible with those civilizations when they don't understand the just metaphysics that are inherent in our understanding of the world?
So, of course, Mbiti wrote this from a theological point of view because he was trying to explain the nature of African religion. But my main takeaway from the parts of the book that I've read...
So important here, this is based in African religion. So it's the religion that is informing then this attempt to philosophize, right? As it often does. Totally normal. But you need to understand religion is the core as to why Africans understand the world this way. And he's looking at time and explaining it this way so that he can make it jive with his theology, because most differences at the end of the day are theological. And so this is very important, okay? Because a lot of people say, oh, this is just genetics, or this is just, and no, it's a mixture of so many things. The identity is yes, it's heritage, but it's also religion, as she said here, central. It's language. As she said, we don't even have the word for the future. So all of these different key factors in identity are working together to make it more or less impossible for people who think this way to operate in a Western society.
Is that unlike Western cultures and religions with end-of-the-world myths, African time has no end. Seasons, years, birth, marriage, death, it's all a cycle. Asante kwa kutazama, tafakari hayo, and I'll see you in the next video.
All right, so, like I said, important video. I think pretty eye-opening for people who aren't familiar with the fact that other peoples do indeed have radically different understandings, not just of small things, right? It's not like, oh, well, maybe they have a slight disagreement over what it means for free speech or, they're no fundamental, core, bedrock assumptions about reality. How does time work? Is there a future? Can you plan things? Is time something you can waste? Should you be looking to better yourself in the future? Should you be planning for your children and grandchildren? These are all very fundamental things that you cannot share values with if you do not have this basic grasp on how the world works. How can you even discuss shared values, an ideology, a propositional nation with people who cannot abstract time? With people who do not believe that abstract time exists? How do you have a conversation, much less share a civilization based on abstract principle with people who cannot abstract time? That's a big one. That's a big one, right? And that doesn't mean, again, that these people are bad. It doesn't mean that people who hold this belief or think this way are like lesser people. I'm not saying any of that. But obviously there's a difference, and a difference that has to be understood. And that difference creates limitations on how you can interact. People who don't understand time cannot participate in a global economy. People who don't understand time the same way that you do cannot understand laws that were created to ensure the future. It just doesn't exist for them. And that's okay. That's the way they live their lives. It's not, wrong in that sense. I would think it's wrong. Yeah, I think time exists. I think there is a future, but that their understanding of it is not malicious. They're not trying to hurt anybody. And if they can't, update that understanding of the past, present, and future, then they probably just aren't going to work in your society. And that needs to be okay. You just need to be okay with that. You don't have to force everyone to believe what you believe. You don't have to conquer the world and turn everybody into a liberal democracy who understands time the way you understand time. You don't have to do that unless your goal is to rule the world, in which case you do need to get rid of the particular beliefs that peoples have. Some that might seem wild and completely incorrect to you. But that doesn't mean you should go out and crush those people and, force your belief on them. You just don't have to, because if you try, then what happens is the situation we're in right now, where we import lots of people who have fundamentally different understandings of religion and abstract values and time, money, economics, all of these things. And of course their civilization doesn't work. How could it work when you have this large of a gap in your understanding?